Okay, so here I am. Here we are, Riot Anatomy Lesson 8. Today there was someone using the studios and someone in my office. So here I am outside my office. And I thought this was what better place to talk about the spine, a nice movable supportive structure than in front of a tree. And give you evidence that it's not always raining in Seattle. So I hope you can hear me okay. I tested the mic. I think it'll be okay. And I'm going to just use one image today, which is also a good reason to be outside. And that will be uploaded to Google Classroom. So I'll talk about that in a bit. So Lesson 8. So picking up on more about the spine. Want to really myth bust for you, and certainly you're going to need to myth bust this for your Alexander students, this idea that's quite rampant that a straighter spine is somehow a better spine. No, not true. Yeah, a straight spine is not a better spine. In fact, our spine is meant to have curves, has always had curves, as Alexander teachers in particular, we want to distinguish between straight and long, or between straightening and lengthening, right? So as you know, what we're looking for in the technique is length along the curves of our spine, not to take the curves out of our spine. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit today about why that is and how that shows up in our support and movement. So the first thing to remember is that our spine never was straight. So sort of inherent in that idea that straighter is better, sort of lurks this assumption that there was a previously straight spine or better spine that we need to return to, right? So our spine never was straight. So yeah, so also kind of getting that that idea that there is this ideal spine out there, striking that from the record as well. So from our most primitive beginnings, and if we talk about our evolutionary history, right, when the spine never was not moving. In fact, we moved the spine. If you think of like a tadpole, how a tadpole moves through the water, they move their spine, or what the precursor to the spine, right? A little bit of what we talked about last week with the notochord. Yeah, in order to move, right? So in movement and in that really primary support that we had evolutionarily speaking, and also in our own human development, is movement from the get-go. Yeah, so okay, so the spine was never straight, and it became increasingly, like I said, it was useful for movement in this sort of fashion, but it's also super, as we evolved to upright, it's also super important for the weight-bearing function, for the supportive function of the spine as well. I shouldn't say for the supportive function as if it's somehow in contrast or even in relationship to movement, because we're going to talk about how support and movement, again, they're these things that aren't even it's even too removed to say that they're in relation to each other. They just are. Support is movement. Yeah, and movement can be support. Right? So when we're looking at the support of the spine, we're looking for that dynamic movement to underlie, not to underlie, to be there with our support. It is our support. So if you, a little more practically speaking, right, in terms of the functionality of the curves of the spine, if we take out the curves of the spine because the spine, as it's created, or as it forms with curves, when we take those curves out, or when we try to take those curves out, we end up doing it muscularly. We have to do something with our muscles to pull our spine into straightness, right? Which means we're back to that conversation about muscles and bones, right? That then the muscles are doing the work of the bones. They're doing more than they need to to hold us up, and the bones aren't getting to do their job, which is to bear weight along curves. To bear weight along curves. So we also lose, if we take the curves out of our spine, and I see this happening a lot with dancers, right, and other sports, I'm sure. I'm just speaking to what I'm familiar with. But this idea of pulling up, of getting taller and getting longer by straightening your spine. And I know I've had to work really hard to get curve into especially my cervical and thoracic curves after many years of pulling up and reverse, well, whatever. You don't need to hear about my drama with my spinal curves. But my point is, one of my points is that another benefit of the curves of the spine is to offer shock absorption for the whole of us, but especially to protect our brain. So if you've ever ridden in a car that doesn't have shocks, ding, 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 yeah, you can feel it in your brain. You can feel what not having that springiness does to what's riding on top of it. So if our brain and our skull is riding on top of our spine, and we don't have the shock absorption that comes with having the curves, we lose that, yeah, or we don't have as much of it available to us. So we want those nice goosh, 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 gushy curves as a shock absorption factor, or feature, I should say. Curves are also really good for movement. Yeah, if you can imagine what it would feel like to move if your spine was a metal rod and you had to move, yeah, you wouldn't get much further than this. In fact, you probably wouldn't even get this much movement, because even in this movement, the base of my spine is having to move a little bit to accommodate this tilt, this turn of my pelvis. Yeah, so we're not going to get any movement through space without curves in our spine. So we need curves for movement, we need them for shock absorption, we need them to bear weight in the most effective way, in a way that the weight transfers through the front of the spine, along through the bones, through the bodies of the vertebra, like we talked about before. So what else does the spine do besides offer movement and support? It protects. So remember last class we looked at how the spinal cord is housed inside that sort of triangular structure of the body and the articular arch. Yeah. So the spine provides this protective function for the brainstem, right? And also as connections for the ribs starts to provide the protection for our organs. Yeah. It connects. So with connective tissue, there are a bunch of organs that attach to the spine. I haven't written them down here. I have them written down somewhere. But organs are tethered into the spine, so it also offers a connective function. And there's also a counterbalancing effect that happens. So if you've ever, this isn't a great example, but I kind of like it, or it's effective, and I sometimes use it with students. Like if you've ever played that game where you've taken a broom, and you got the handle of the broom here, and you're keeping the broom from falling over. This way in which something stays balanced or dynamically balanced when the base of support is really underneath the heavy part of the long structure. I mean, a broom in that way sort of models this reverse pendulum image that's sometimes used to talk about the head as this heavy weight at the top of the long support of the spine. So if you imagine you're playing that game, or if you're imagining you're trying to get the support for yourself underneath this heavy head, yeah, we can think about the curves in relation to that function as well. So if you think of the cervical curve as having to kind of come underneath the head, yeah, the cervical curve comes underneath the head to support it, yeah, it curves forward to support the weight of the head, and then it has this then the spine curves back or towards your back, right, and creates space for the thoracic cavity, for the heart and the lungs. Yeah, and then there's more weight in the front. The heart and the lungs are heavy, Yeah, so then at the lumbar spine, the spine gets underneath all that weight to support the weight of what's above. And then again, it curves back in space with the sacral curve to create the back of the sort of the pelvic basin for the pelvic organs, etc. This is one thing I wanted to say that I didn't say last time, how all the vertebrae are different shaped. We talked about that a little bit as they go down, but that they do get bigger and bigger as they go down. So when I got down here and I was talking about the lumbar vertebra coming underneath the thoracic spine to support it, I was like feeling that in my body, that these are the biggest vertebra in our body, or the lumbar vertebra. And we know that's the case in part because by the time you get to that I don't know, part of your spine, the spine is taking all the weight of the head and the thorax up to that point. So remember that when bone bears weight, it grows denser and bigger to accommodate that weight and that function. So in its weight-bearing function, the vertebra get bigger and denser as we move down the spine. I meant to mention that last time, and I didn't. So yeah. So support is dynamic. Support is about movement, and Peggy Hackney in the reading for this week really stresses that. So I think she offers some nice imagery for thinking about your spine that you could try out on your own. And just as a little background of her, she is a Laban trained person and a Barteniev fundamentals teacher. I think she's she used to be on faculty here at the University of Washington for many years. In fact, I think she was here when she was writing that book. Now she's somewhere in California. But it's a great book. I just read it this summer for the first time. And so the excerpt you have it's an excerpt, so don't be alarmed that it doesn't start at the beginning of the chapter. But anyway, play around with some of that imagery if it works for you. And in particular, there's a nice figure 8 image that I've worked with Nanette before in a different context than Barteniev, but I found really, really helpful. So I'm going to remind Nanette, or you can remind Nanette to go through that figure 8 image with you and pair that with our Alexander directions, because they go really, really nicely together. Okay, so let's look at the particulars of the curves. I have my little drawing that I made here that I'll put on Google Classroom. I hope you can see this. So these are the curves we're looking to balance, yeah? And I've drawn the curves that go, if you will, backwards in space in red, and the ones that curve forward in space in blue. And just to give you a little language around how people talk about these curves, is that a curve that goes, the curve that goes towards the back, if you will, like the thoracic curve and the sacral curve that we've looked at so far, is also called primary. Yeah, primary curves or kyphotic curves. Or if you hear someone talk about having kyphosis, it means like a hunchback, yeah, an exaggerated kyphotic curve, or an exaggerated primary curve to the spine. The secondary curves are the ones that are going to curve towards the front, or they're also called lordotic. So someone with a sway back also might be, another word for sway back is lordosis. In other words, an excessive lordotic curve or an excessive secondary curve. So the traditional curves of the spine are the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. I think we talked about those last week. 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and another, by my count, 5 sacral. And then there are also in some schools of thought, and I really like to play around with this, especially relative to my Alexander directions, about there being another curve at the top and another at the bottom. So an occipital curve that sort of matches that curve of the back of the skull, right? And then a coccygeal curve, so heading the other way from the sacrum, as if you had a tail that might wag out that way. Yeah, so I think it's really nice to think of the curves of the spine continuing, and then even continuing, that's why I have the arrows, sort of continuing energetically, even past the boundaries of our, physical structure. So these are the curves we're looking to dynamically interface with, right, in our Alexander practice, and looking to balance, to find support and movement through all of these curves. And yeah, so when we're born, when we're babies, and we'll probably go through some DART procedures in the RIOT training. The DART procedures draw heavily on these primary and secondary curves, as do a lot of developmental movement sort of modalities. And DART looks at combining also primary and secondary curves to find spirals. And there's a lot we can do with that, and we will. But just so you know that language when we dive into that. When babies are born, well, there's some debate on this, because there is a way in which, when you're a fetus and you're in the fetal curve and you're in the womb, you're primarily in a primary curved this way. Yeah, and then there's this idea that when you're born or when you're birthed out the birth canal is this sort of first experience of secondary. And I don't really want to go into all the implications of primary and secondary. If you guys want to talk about that with Nanette in class, you can. Or we could maybe later on, if I have time later in the term, we could talk about sort of the implications of primary and secondary, because they tend to sort of take on these characteristics, primary being more about self and the interior experience and coming back to home, if you will, and secondary being more about relating out to the world and relating to your surroundings and to other people. So that's a little preview or something to chew on. Let's see. What else did I want to say? I wanted to clarify the difference between the curves of the spine and movements of the spine. Yeah, so the primary and secondary curves that we're talking about, or that we're sort of mapping onto the spine, don't have to do with movements through space. Yeah, they have to do with the curves that are present in the spine, no matter what movement you're doing, right? And then you can use movement. So we might talk about moving into a primary shape, yeah, or moving into a more secondary shape. But not to confuse the two, or think that the primary and secondary curves of the spine that we were just talking about are things that you have to do or make happen, right? So we don't want to think of them as positions or shapes that we make. We're talking about them as just the natural curves and that exist in the spine, whether or not we're in primary or secondary expressions. And again, we could go on and on about, and they will in DART, about how the upper body can be going into secondary while the lower body is going into primary, and how that happens in cross patterns and spirals. So really interesting stuff. Let's see, I wanted to touch on just one last thing in this lesson, and that's just to talk about the planes of movement, give you some vocabulary around planes of movement, because as we go along and talk more about movement at joints, it's going to be useful information to have. So there are three main planes of movement that we talk about happening, or movements happening along. And of course, no movement ever happens in just one plane, because we're three-dimensional. Okay, so we're always doing three-dimensional movement. But we can talk about movement happening more in one plane than another plane, and it's a useful way of talking about the kind of movements that are happening. So the three main planes of movement are the vertical plane, also known as the doorway plane. Yeah, if I was standing in a doorway, this plane that I'm standing in is known as the vertical plane. Yeah, so a movement that might happen, it's also called the coronal plane, like a crown. Yeah, so if I was wearing a crown like this, it would be in this plane. Yeah, so movements that might happen on the coronal plane would be a cartwheel, or this what I'm doing, right? Whatever this is, a wave, what are those waves that the royal family does? Yeah, that's movement in the vertical plane. And when we talk about what that movement is in the spine, it's called lateral flexion. Yeah, lateral flexion, lateral meaning side to side, flexion meaning bending. Yeah. So the other movement that we just kind of touched on when I was talking about primary and secondary is this movement. So this is spinal flexion. Spinal flexion. Yeah, this is spinal extension. Yeah, I'm gonna go backwards. So flexion, extension of the spine, and this is happening in the plane that's called the sagittal plane. Yeah, Sagittarius, guy with the arrow. Yeah, so that's how you remember it. So this is called the sagittal plane. Movement that's happening in a sagittal plane might be a, I don't know, back handspring, which I can't do, a somersault. Yeah, anything that's one of these guys, whatever these are called, warrior, one of the warriors. Yeah, sagittal plane. Sagittal plane, flexion and extension of the spine. Yeah, so the action is flexion and extension. The plane is sagittal. And then the last plane is horizontal. So also known as like the tabletop plane. Yeah, so if you imagine there's a table and I'm moving my arms along the table, this is called the horizontal plane. Horizontal plane. So movement that happens in the horizontal plane, turning, yeah. Yeah, turning, rotation around a central axis. Yeah, horizontal plane. So, and the action that this is, I just said it, but rotation, right? So when the spine rotates like a barber pole, yeah, which is sort of again, it's a spiralic action because it's always happening in 3 dimensions. But when we have that, if you think of an owl turning its head around, yeah, that primary movement being around the central axis, that's known as rotation. I hope you can hear me, it's getting a little windy. Okay, so I mentioned those just to build that vocabulary in, and if you want to review them, there's a plate in the anatomy coloring book that goes over them, and also you can use Google. Those are pretty basic planes of movement that are out there that people talk about. I wanted to bring them up also because to make the point about in terms of movement of the spine, that at between each vertebra of the spine all the way down, movement in all 3 of those planes are possible. So in theory, between any 2 vertebrae, I can flex and extend, I can rotate, and I can bend side to side. Yeah. That said, different parts of our spine are better equipped for one or another of those movements. Yeah. And one way you can tell, or one way that's kind of cool, in that our form sort of matches our function, is if you look at the facet joints or the articular processes that we talked about last time, the joints in the back of the spine, one on each side, the right and the left, the angle at which the facet joints are situated on the vertebra tells you about how those bones are sort of built to best move. Yeah. So at the cervical spine level, the facet joints are almost horizontal. They're a little bit tilted, but they're the joints themselves. So this is the inferior and this is the superior facet joint, as an example. They're almost horizontal like this. Yeah. So the movement that's going to happen on that plane is this way. Yeah, so cervical spine, back to kind of the owl image, the cervical spine is really good at rotation. Yeah, it also does flexion and extension pretty well and side to side. But if you look at the facet joints, they're particularly skilled at facilitating rotation of the head. And again, we could talk about why that might be, right? The importance of, evolutionarily speaking, our eyes being able to move around and scan the horizon for, tigers or what have you. So cervical spine, neck, really good at rotation, side to side movement. As we move down into the thoracic spine, the facet joints start to do this, start to even out this way. Again, I'm exaggerating gross level to make a point, but they're more this way, yeah, in the vertical plane. Yeah, so they're doing this, the superior and the inferior are like this. So they're really good at doing this. Yeah, so side to side, we get good side to side movement in the thoracic spine. And again, if you think of that like those lamina as little scales and imagine how a fish moves through the water, you can think about how the thoracic spine has a lot of this quality to it. Yeah, certainly, at least for me, rotation is harder in the thoracic spine, and we definitely have certainly less extension in the thoracic spine, also because of the shape of the vertebra themselves. The little tails on the thoracic vertebra are a little longer, so they impede some of the backwards extension motion, which might also be a protective function in terms of not wanting us to, I don't know, I'm making that up. Might serve a protective function for the front, that we can't go too far back. Yeah, I don't know. Then when we get down to the lumbar spine, the facet joints are more like this, more in the sagittal plane. Yeah, so the vertebra by vertebra are meeting each other like this, which is going to create this kind of movement, which we need for, guess what? Locomotion, running and walking. Yeah, so I just think that's kind of a cool, and I want you to do this little mini hand dance with me. I learned this from Amy, yeah. So if you think cervical, everyone do this with me, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, yeah. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar. And I just like that. I like that movement. I like that sort of expression of the sort of draping of the facet joints and how they dynamically change as they go down the spine to facilitate these different kinds of movement that we need. So I hope that makes sense. I think that's all I want to say for now. Signing off from Seattle. Who knows where I'll be next time? But yeah. Okay. Thanks.